Today, as we mark the Human Rights Day, commemorating the proclamation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the Human Rights Center is designed to highlight ongoing efforts, challenges, opportunities for advancing human rights education. In outlining a manifesto of rights as a common standard for achievement for all peoples and nations, the UDHR calls on every individual and every organ of society to strive by teaching and education to promote respect for the rights enumerated in the Declaration. Of course, the elaboration of that education itself makes clear that human rights education is a conduit for the realization of all human rights. Today also marks, incidentally, the 16th anniversary of the proclamation of the World Program on Human Rights Education, which is now its fourth phase. For this phase, highlighting the importance of rights education for human rights realization, for the youth in particular. Now it's my honor today to moderate a discussion of a panel comprising, as you've seen the flyer, three eminent persons here. First up, Professor Felisa Tibbets, who holds a UNESCO Chair on Human Rights Education, Higher Education, I beg your pardon. She also holds the Chair in Human Rights Education in the Department of Law, Economics and Governance at Utrecht University, and she's lecturer in International Education and Development Program at Teachers College in Columbia University. The other panelists are from Essex, my colleagues Dr. Aoife Duffy, Co-Deputy Director at the Human Rights Center, who is leading on human rights education for the center. Dr. Carlos Jiju, Deputy Director, Center for Migration Studies at Essex University, an expert on role of social movements in advancing rights of refugees and migrants. So without further ado, I thought I'd first turn to Professor Felisa Tibbets and pose to her her reflections on what pedagogical frameworks can ensure rights education is done through human rights. May I turn over to you, Professor Felisa Tibbets, please.
Thank you, Professor Shahid, for moderating today, and a pleasure to be here with you all, Essex people. Thank you for inviting me in. And it's a great question, of course, how to think about delivery of human rights education, the pedagogy. I had the opportunity to consider this question, of course, before this very moment. So what I'd like to do now is to share some thoughts I have. I have to go to the beginning of my slideshow. So I'm calling it critical human rights education. There have been, there's been a lot of attention in the last, I would say 10, 15 years actually, by scholars, but I'm sure also by practitioners around how to deliver human rights education. I have now a frame in front of you that already shows that there's so many different political, historical, social, and cultural contexts in which human rights education is taken. I might back up and say that when I first started to do human rights education, which was 25 years ago, it had been populated, I think, predominantly by law-related education and human rights education. So it was typically law professors that had done human rights education. But there had been in Latin America, in popular education, human rights education happening in that way. So what's happened, I think, over the last years is a kind of coming together between the more populist approach, which is where we find the pedagogy of Freire and critical human rights education and transformative education, that language coming up, and move a bit away, but still keeping some elements of learning some of the basics of human rights in terms of international human rights standards. Otherwise, it's not human rights. The question is how to do it. So, so those of us who are doing human rights education, the big picture, of course, is that like with any other educational enterprises, especially those that are values oriented, we do need to take into account so many different contexts in order for human rights education to be relevant and effective with learners. There's scholarship around this. These are some of the some excerpts I found. They're a bit long, but I love them because I think they are so articulate, more than I can be, about how important it is that when we're doing human rights education, we're also thinking about human rights as constructed and interpreted within a plurality of cultural, religious, and philosophical doctrines. And even another quote here about suturing human rights with the multiple histories and cultures and contexts in which we find history of struggle. So that's kind of the backdrop to say, I will of course speak about pedagogy, means to sort of approaches to methodologies of instruction and learning, but I want to recognize that the whole approach really for human rights in any particular context is a critical one in the sense of the scholarship offers us critical thinking, not just dropping in, but again, suturing with local histories in sort of meaningful ways. Now, the World Program for Human Rights Education indeed is wonderful that you mentioned that. Inside of the World Program for Human Rights Education is a reference, of course, well, now there's a reference to the UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, which came after the World Program. Here we find the aims identifying education through human rights. And perhaps it's worthwhile, since I'm answering the question, to make a little bit of a distinction, perhaps my interpretation, between education about, through, and for human rights. Education about human rights obviously has to do with some of that content that's very unique to human rights. So it could be the international human rights standards, the values associated with human rights. Again, those values aren't unique to human rights, but they have been emphasized and underlined by human rights and offered maybe as a secular framework, values framework. So education about human rights, there's absolutely some content there. In fact, often that's what you find in syllabi for schools. Education through human rights is how it is carried out. The idea being that the way in which it's carried out pedagogically, in methodologies, in the culture of the learning environment should all reflect human rights and should be effective in promoting action, motivation around human rights, attachment to human rights as a value system, and interest and perhaps even capacities to act on human rights, to promote and protect them, not only for yourself, but for others. So education through human rights is all about the whole environment in which you're learning human rights, and also the culture, but also very specifically pedagogy, which is what I'll get into. Education for human rights, of course, makes it
the standard very high there, the gold standard of human rights education, as all these things are met. So education for human rights means that there will be some residue left over from human rights education with learners. That's not only some knowledge and awareness of human rights, but some, again, motivation and interest to make a difference, to act on it. So I know this seems, just because I got the question of pedagogy, I don't usually quote myself, but I actually found, I did some more thinking actually about pedagogy. So I want to share about this. I had originally had 3 models of human rights education based, by the way, from experience and working and thinking about what my colleagues were doing about 25 years ago. But I updated those recently. And I updated those in particular around teaching and learning strategies, because I thought, I think we know more now in the field than we used to. And it became apparent to me, as I mentioned earlier, that there are many people in the field doing human rights education for whom it was transmission of content, because it had a lot to do with legal standards. So I proposed these sort of distinctive teaching and learning strategies, which one is just didactic, another is participatory, another is instrumentally empowering, and the other is transformational. I'm trying to skip ahead and tell you what I mean by these, and see if this is true for you. This is what this is my observations, my thinking. But for those of you who are doing human rights education, I invite you to think about whether this is relevant for you. So I think we can find kind of 4 clusters of methodologies. One is didactic, which is just, delivery of content and lectures. There's absolutely a role for that in human rights education, but I would argue if it's the only methodology you're using, you're not going to reach that gold standard of HRE where you are ultimately motivating students to do something, right, about human rights, because experiential pedagogies, active methodologies, and some of those other pedagogies associated with critical thinking, problem-solving approaches are not linked with didactic methods. So the idea is that there is a link with also even dialogical education can be very, very important for motivating people into action. So didactics alone, not sufficient. Participatory, we hear a lot about participatory methodologies, but they're used in lots of different subjects. So, and again, it's wonderful. Participatory, to my mind, means you're just participating in the learning. So you're organizing learning in the classroom so that students are not passive learners, they're active learners. Great. Empowerment-oriented pedagogies, I think, generally are oriented towards capacities of learners, like empowered to do critical thinking, for example, empowered around problem solving, empowered around being able to work on a team. So a lot of so-called empowerment kinds of methodologies, again, I don't think are all that we might want in human rights education. I think the language that we're hearing now from scholarship around human rights education, and I would argue also in practice, is that it should be transformative. And it's kind of a jargon, but it's linked with, there are even some scholars that say you don't even call it human rights education, call it transformative human rights education, because that speaks to the liberating potential of human rights education. It's kind of a grand idea, but the idea that it should be emancipatory, it should be liberating, it should move people into action. And in that case, then the pedagogies it wouldn't be sufficient, for example, that a student would even learn how to be, develop an action plan to do something in their community, but that they would actually want to be doing something in the community, that there would be something shifting inside the student for whom, let's say, the human rights values framework allows them to, and encourages them to make sense of the world and try to influence it in some ways. So I think this is very relevant for the question of pedagogies. And again, it links up with transformative, emancipatory, and critical pedagogy. But what I'd like to do, if I may, just for 2 more minutes, is kind of disrupt a little bit of what you, or certainly I, had been assuming around pedagogies, because I've now made a case for being thoughtful about pedagogies and tried to at least distinguish between empowerment and participatory oriented pedagogies, at least in a general way, and the notion that HRE should be transformative, emancipatory, critical, right? But, and I've been doing some research on this. So these are just some things that are key. So I want to talk a little bit about schools. Many of us are working in schools in human rights education. We've seen evidence that human rights education, human rights is showing up more and more in curriculum across the world. Now, I'm not a non-critic, by the way, of human rights. I'm thinking for myself how important it is when you do human rights education to keep the critical perspective. So just so you understand, I'm not comfortable with HRE as an ideology. I think we have to keep that critical piece in there for it to be really meaningful for learners, to give them also the space to decide, and this is what do I think about what's being proposed in the human rights framework and human rights values. But I just want to put that on the side. But anyway, so we see a lot of human rights showing up now in curriculum, national curriculum and resources. Now, this doesn't speak to how meaningful it is, how much depth it goes into, but there's something there. However, when we look at TALIS, which is this sort of cross-national study on teachers and teaching, as recently as 2018, the cross-national data shows that teachers excel in teacher-centered transmission of information, that is really what we're seeing. And here are a few other statistics from just a couple of years ago. Only 60% of those teachers, this is on average, of course there's a range, it depends on the country, but on average only 60% of teachers organize students for small group work. 78% say they require students to think critically, but only 46% ask students to solve problem tasks on their own. So it's just as a point, it raises a question about what is realistic for HRE if we think about it being, and we want it to be a kind of standard, and maybe we could discuss whether we think that's a good idea, right? That every teacher should be required to do HRE. Maybe we wouldn't agree that that's a good idea. But if we want to entertain the idea, we do have to be thinking about this issue that teachers aren't necessarily able to, or in a position, maybe because their classrooms have 60 students in them, to use some of the methodologies that we associate with human rights education. And the last thing I want to share, and then I'll conclude, is the results of the study, and this is the part that surprised me, I participated with a few other scholars in a study of students. It was a very small scale study, by the way. So these are 857 students across, sorry, these different countries. But students, it was all students' perspective. One of the things they were asked about is where they learned human rights and what methodologies they remembered their teachers using, and how much they felt what they had learned in schools affected what they thought about human rights. Interesting questions, I think. So one thing I can just say, this is not representative of human rights education in these countries. Obviously, it's very high because of the nature of the teachers that were asked to have their students complete the survey. So in all these cases, we expected to find something in the classrooms. So that's not a surprise. But so just to say, the students had learned, the students we surveyed had human rights in the classroom. And on a scale of 1 to 5, you'll see that there was some indication by the students of how much they've learned about human rights. And the only thing I can maybe sort of mention here is that it's a little bit lower for Sweden, and it was a little bit lower in terms of whether they've been exposed to human rights, and a little slightly higher for the US, but as compared to these other countries. But these are not really large numbers, so they're not meaningful. But I wanted to give you an idea of what we asked the students to do. But we also asked them how they remembered learning human rights. And this is where I found myself very surprised, because we did see a variation. Here I've highlighted in yellow across the countries in terms of whether or not they did small group discussion or even whole class discussion. And again, this was a fairly, I would say, human rights education amenable set of students in terms of classrooms. But we see a variation from 32% to 91%. Wasn't by any means the norm. I mean, you could, if you worked on the average, perhaps. If you look down to read the textbook, you find that, you can see it for yourself, 68%, 76, 62, kind of lower for the United States, where they were using primary sources. So I thought that was really kind of remarkable, given that it was human rights education, all the language we have around, using methods like these. You can see some of the other results here. We have a lot of details, but I looked and see, well, this is surprising, but let's just see, according to the students, that these are the students' perspectives, what kinds of teaching methods were statistically significant for those classrooms where students had said 5 out of 5, what I did in school around human rights really influenced what I think about human rights. In other words, it would be an argument that whatever methodologies the teachers are using in these particular classrooms, they were very effective because students said, I learned so much human rights in these classes. So there were only 2 countries where we found any statistically significant associations. And for the USA, these were maybe some of the kinds of methods we might expect: answering questions from the teacher, working in a small group, personal involvement in a social action project related to human rights, extracurricular activities. Here we see maybe some of the methodologies we've thought about, right? The participatory, action or experiential. But if we go to South Africa, we find also statistically significant results, and they're reading the textbook, they're taking notes, they're listening to lectures, they're doing some of these other things, but it's very much more a kind of mixture of methodologies, very much a mixture. And it's made me think, and I hope it's also made you think a little bit, because it makes me realize that even as we talk about human rights education, and perhaps we're talking universally about certain kinds of pedagogies, maybe we need to step back a bit and actually ask ourselves, regardless of the fact that we believe in the Freirean model, the pedagogical framework, and if we want it to be transformative, that we are still, in terms of formal schooling, very much working in different systems with different traditions, and there are different kinds of methodologies that might be effective. I know also in research I've done with Amnesty International, in some places, it was sometimes the power of human rights education is just the message of human rights. I would argue it's not the end, but sometimes just just the message of human rights and the imagination of, about how the world might be different, and the invitation to try to influence the world is an important first step. So so that's what I wanted to share with in terms of pedagogical frameworks. It obviously has implications also for teacher education and training. Thank you so much, Professor Shahid, for the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you, Professor Tevitz, for that fascinating presentation. A lot of food for thought there. I'm sure, a lot of questions from the audience when we come to that. Let me quickly now go to our next speaker, my colleague Aoife. And for both Aoife and Carlos, I want to look at a takeaway from the former presentation about the transformative aspect of education, and see if your thoughts on how education can address asymmetrical power relations, and how that can help to transform society or shape society. Aoife, can I invite you to present on that, please? Thank you.
Okay, will do. Thanks. Thank you. So I will try to address that question now. As I explained to colleagues before this call, I do get quite nervous when presenting my own material. So I am going to read a couple of pages, and that should settle my nerves. I'll try to use my Irish accent to good effect, so hopefully it's not too boring for you. The title of this presentation is Pushing Human Rights Education Beyond the Law. And in a way, it does pick up on some of what Professor Tibbets was describing or talking about in a critical human rights education. It's just one particular interdisciplinary approach to bring to the human rights education classroom in thinking about asymmetrical power relations in society. I'll explain a little bit behind the framework, the nascent framework I'd like to develop, and the reasons for this approach. Structural violence is a concept first introduced by Johan Galtung in 1969 to progress the field of peace studies. According to Galtung, violence is present in society when people's actual realizations are below their potential realizations. When there is no immediate or obvious actor responsible, this is structural violence. Violence is built into the structures that manifest in unequal access to power and resources, and therefore unequal life chances. Galtung has since contributed a body of work on structural violence and related concepts, such as personal and cultural violence, but the idea has transcended its original peace studies genesis to be applied to other realms such as anthropology, clinical medicine, and sociology. I want to argue that such a way of viewing societal complexity is necessary for human rights education into the future for several different reasons. While there are many different approaches to human rights education today, most commentators suggest that human rights education ought to cover content and processes related to international human rights law. However, Zemblias critiques the framing of human rights as universal norms in juridical language. Currently, juridical human rights education taught through legal frameworks cannot very well explain the cultural and political complexities that give rise to human rights violations. In fact, the explanatory power of juridical human rights education has not really increased since the proliferation of human rights education programs within the academy. Secondly, juridical human rights education cannot explain why, when human rights violations do occur, that impunity rather than accountability seems to be the general pattern, or that some people claiming rights does not appear to increase the availability of rights for the many. Thus, this conventional approach to human rights education, expressed as an abstract set of principles and rules for states, has proven limited when contrasted with persistent and extensive human rights violations around the world. When a narrow human rights discourse prioritizes technical and institutional expertise without the ability to reflect on its own epistemological basis, according to Zemblias, this results in a manufactured education predicated on Eurocentric assumptions about humanity. Andre Keat describes as declarationist an approach to human rights education which constitutes, open quote, the almost dogmatic belief that all human rights truths are generated and consummated within human rights instruments such as declarations, conventions, and covenants. This declarationist mainstream approach to human rights education in legal terms hides a blatant contradiction between these universal human rights norms and the factual experience of many people's limited access to these rights. The rhetoric of the declarationist language doesn't really help, because what is needed is a self-reflective and critical approach interrogating some of the assumptions upon which human rights education is based. There are other alternative approaches to human rights education, such as provided by our panelists today, Felicit Tibbets, and also Manisha Bajaj, that clearly link the pedagogy of human rights education to the potential for societal transformation. I would like to follow their lead and to further argue that human rights education needs to be able to present to students a conceptual comprehension of power and privilege. Understanding such frameworks is a step in the direction to tackling deep-seated structures which, if dismantled, might improve the availability of social goods called rights for vast swathes of the world's population. Human rights education needs disciplines such as sociology, philosophy, economics, political theory, psychology, to name a few, to address societal injustices, inequalities, and discrimination. If the normative vision of human rights was reasserted as a social justice project of what constitutes the good life for everyone in society, this would push educators beyond the conservative tradition of human rights through the lens of juridical rules and procedures. This is why I'd like to return to the idea of structural violence and make a few concluding observations on its application in the human rights classroom. In my view, structural violence is sustained by rarely visible social structures that confine and reduce people's life choices and agency, so that social capital is not enjoyed on the same terms as dominant groups within society. To say that occupying a space of privilege occurs on the basis of merit belies the fact that these restraining structures are shaped by pernicious ideologies, racism, sexism, disableism, capitalism, xenophobia, homophobia, to name a few. Maybe privilege at the top of the pyramid can be achieved through incredible effort when people overcome these invisible structures. However, I would argue that this is the exception, and it is likely that such individuals simply become co-opted into those same structures rather than tackling the underlying structural violence and associated ideologies. I would like to be able to, in my human rights education practice, support students to reflect on the phenomenon of structural violence and how this reduces rights for so many people, to understand how certain social, legal, and economic institutions are structured in these ways, and that international human rights law and its associated mechanisms cannot be understood in complete isolation or divorced from such social orderings. This is what Andrew Fagan describes as the gentrification of human rights. Human rights fail, open quote, to identify and engage with fundamental forms of social and economic injustice precisely because it is itself a product of these systemic and structural forces. It is part of the very predicament it largely fails to discern. When discussing the pyramid scheme of privilege with a friend, she put it quite simply in the observation that privilege is not occurring on the basis of merit because the game is rigged. In order to critically reflect on these social orderings and associated epistemologies, we need something like standpoint theory to figure out our position on the pyramid of privilege, to confront these forms of injustice. I would like to argue that there are gradations in the subjective experience of structural violence based on the look of the draw, from less extreme exclusions to more complete exclusions, and that no society, even a seemingly peaceable society, is free from structural violence. Similar to Kimberly Crenshaw's seminal work on intersectionality, I'd like to use such a model to understand the aggregate effect of structural exclusions on certain people and groups in society. Therefore, to sum up, and in response to the question about understanding asymmetrical power relations in society, human rights education needs to move beyond a juridical approach to understanding human rights, and to assert or to reassert a commitment to social justice. I pose this model of structural violence and human rights as one such approach, but recognize that there are many others, and that we also need to be open to incorporating different traditions and cultural conceptualizations of social justice into our human rights education. Thank you.
Thank you, Aoife. You have highlighted, I think, a number of aspects that we need to engage subsequently, especially the critical approaches to human rights as a way to unlock the transformative potential of human rights. And I think, Carlos's presentation also will approach some of these aspects, but once you have that presentation, we can have a discussion about how the three presentations actually, converge on this point of transformation through human rights education. Carlos, may I invite you to make a presentation, please? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much first for the invitation, and I think it's very close to my heart to be in this meeting. And I'm going to start by saying that for me, human rights is a vocation. And the way I talk, my issue is not to get nervous when I talk, is because I talk too much. So that's what I need to keep an eye on the clock. But for me, so my starting point, and this relates to my life in human rights, is that for me, human rights is a vocation. And that is very, very important. And I think it fits very well into the question of how to deliver human rights. So for me, my starting point is my vocation in relation to human rights. So for you to understand where I'm coming from, I can tell you I'm from Chile, that I do research on human rights in relation to indigenous peoples. And also I do research on human rights in relation to asylum seekers and refugees. That's why I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Migration here in Essex. So that's where I stand. And also as part of my academic capacity, I have to, quote, brackets, teach human rights, but I really don't teach human rights. What I do, I contribute in an interdisciplinary way to a reflection about how human rights actually work in practice. So my colleagues in law will teach human rights. What I do is to develop a critical examination about how human rights are constructed, developed, negotiated, expanded, with a very strong focus on a community-based approach, if I may say that. So going back to the human rights as a vocation, when I was thinking about this, I said, how did I start in this? And the first thing I need to be honest, I never received any formal training in human rights whatsoever, not because of my studies or anything like that. But I already gave you an indication of where I'm coming from. I'm from Chile. Because I grew up in a country with a military dictatorship, from very early on, I was aware about human rights. Not because no one taught me about human rights, but because human rights were a catalyst for mobilization, for defense, for resistance. And I learned this experience of human rights through my family, first because of a number of different situations in my own family at that time. I learned about human rights in the Catholic Church in the context of Chile in that time, very much, where I was involved and actively involved and developed a number of community organizations with youth and so on. I came across human rights working with community organizations in shantytowns, with unions, with student unions. They were all illegal at the time. And one of the things that, and of course, I learned human rights through activism, my political engagement at the time. So one of the things that all of these experiences have in common is that they shaped the way I understood human rights. First, because I've always understood human rights as a community dialogue experience, a community dialogical experience. I only can understand human rights in dialogue with others. And this prevents something that Aoife highlighted really clearly, because it prevents these asymmetrical relations of power. So it's not about me teaching human rights to someone else. It's about engaging collectively in human rights, where we are all equals in that sense. And I think this is a really important principle that we tend to forget. So I don't teach human rights, as I said before. So when I go to the classroom with my beloved students in human rights, or sociology, human rights, law and human rights, philosophy, human rights, and you name it, love them dearly, second or third years, or master's students are reflecting about human rights and refugees and asylum seekers, I try to translate into that space my own experience of understanding and working with human rights. First thing I expect from my students, and if some of you of my students are here today, you will recognize this. The first thing is that for me, education of human rights has to start with a self-awareness of where do you stand in relation to rights. So what about your own personal experience of rights? And this, I think, is extremely important because it's not only about talking about human rights elsewhere. That tends to be something very common in Western institutions. So it's not about human rights in Africa. It's not about human rights in Latin America. It's not about human rights in other places. So where do you stand, Melanie, James, Carlos, Felipe, Hamed? Where do you stand in relation to human? What is your own experience? 17, 18, 19 years old, it doesn't matter. Where do you stand? For me, that's the starting point. Have you experienced that your rights have been infringed, affected yourself, in your family, in your community, in your country? What level of awareness and experience do you have? Because everyone brings something to the table. And unless we acknowledge this starting point, it's very difficult to discuss human rights without falling into a very formal set of regulations and things like that. So self-awareness, biography, experience is very important. I'm sure that each one of us in this seminar, all of us, the panelists and the people who are viewing, as I speak, because I'm a motivational speaker, are reflecting about your own journey in human rights. And I try to transmit this with my students, that we need to reflect from our own journeys because it keeps us focused for life on what it matters and what it doesn't. The second thing is that I understand individuals and communities as subjects of rights. So it's not that individuals and communities don't have rights. We all have rights. And this sounds absolutely obvious, but the obvious sometimes can be forgotten. And I think it's important to reinstate this. So it's not about me working in a human rights organization that's a worldwide network, going to a place to teach human rights to people who, by incidentally, are the ones who are fighting the rights every single day of their lives. So the only way they can work is in a dialogical process where the relationships of power are equal. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And it can lead to many conflicting outcomes. The other thing is that I expect from the students, from the communities that I work with, is a sense of self-awareness about human rights, how human rights actually operate institutionally in the place where you are. For example, how does University of Essex complies with human rights? Not because we have a human rights center. It means that in the University of Essex, human rights are respected and protected. You as a student, you as a member of staff, have you ever experienced rights infringement, threats, a complex dynamic of power inside your own institution? If you work in the United Nations, if you work in Amnesty, if you work in Human Rights Watch, if you work in any organization who works in human rights, what are the relationships of power within your organization? The sense of self-awareness is not only about yourself, but also in the place where you work and you develop your life. And I think that is very important. Obviously, it has to be interdisciplinary. I believe just as much as it is important to dialogue in a community-based where everybody has a say and an experience and something to contribute, but at the same time, different disciplines have different out. This is why I love working in the Human Rights Center, because we have colleagues from philosophy, from law, from government, from politics, and we all contribute in different ways. And I think this is really important. And finally, so I can stick to my time, I will say that what I just described is the way I don't like to use the word teach human rights, but help us to reflect about human rights in practice. And if I don't bring in the biographical aspect, the sense of self-awareness of your own context, your standpoint, it's very, very difficult that we can understand how human rights actually work. And in that sense, I will finish with this. In my experience of human rights, and I'm sure we all agree on this, I have learned more about human rights working with communities and people fighting for their rights day by day that I have learned formally by any form of teaching. And I think it's important because otherwise we transform education as a top-down approach. And I think Felisa was very clear in the principles she formulated, because what I'm saying basically encapsulates that, is that human rights are grounded on, like Professor Lydia Morris, who's a colleague and a mentor of mine in sociology, says, the embodiment of rights is important as a principle. Rights don't happen in an abstract or in a vacuum. happen in individual in bodily existences. And it's important to acknowledge the variety and different experiences that happen to all of us. So having said all of that, my only aim in life is that when I have a space to work with students, or when I have the space to work with communities, is that the transformative experience has to be for me and for them, for all of us, in that dialogical process of human rights. Okay, that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. I think three of you have demonstrated what a broad canvas we are on, how broad and three-dimensional that canvas is. Now, there's some comments I want to make to all three of you, but before I do that, I want to just announce to our audience that they can post questions in the Q&A function or chat function, and I hope the chat panelists will have a chance to respond to these. In terms of three presentations we have heard today, there are some common threads that are coming out of it. For me, some key takeaways. One, of course, is the diversity of approaches that we have to take and can take to human rights education. But some things already stand out. The direction of approach is very limited, that there is a far richer way of doing this through other aspects, through active learning, through looking at the critical approaches to this, by looking at different learning cultures, engaging with that, and really customizing to the context, as it were, to make the best of it. And also to look at human education as a transformative tool, serving the core form of education of emancipation of individuals. Now, before I have a common question to all three of you, because we are in the pandemic phase, and in this phase, we have seen many challenges, not just education itself, but human rights as well. And the more we use available means like the current online facility, the more, of course, we expose the rights vulnerabilities as well. And of course, we can think more about that. But before I just want to pose a question to Aoife, and perhaps a bit to Carlos as well. Can your perspectives be accused of being ideological in terms of trying to frame human rights in these different frames? Or is it inescapable that human rights will become, in a sense, ideological, attach some sort of hegemonic understandings? And if so, does value pluralism then offer, if you like, a real challenge to how we educate people on human rights? Aoife, Carlos, even Phyllis can comment on this. And also another question to all three of you is about the pandemic. How does your presentations on how to do human rights education really reflect on the challenges we're facing in the pandemic situation? So I think two questions then to all three of you, if I may.
Okay, will I start? I might just push back a little bit about a characterization as ideological. I don't really think necessarily that what I presented was very ideological, only insofar as it's strange. When you go into critical theory or critical pedagogies, you do enter, I think, a space of maybe pulling things down and saying what's wrong. Actually, I want to maybe be able to propose something, a framework that's really positive. I don't necessarily know if that's ideological. I actually think it's functional and practical. It could be really instrumental. It could be, rather than saying all of these, this list of things that we have wrong with the academy, with human rights, with the world, but it could be like a sociology of human rights justice. So it's much more positive, and it's something that students can wrap their heads around, and it's something that you can get behind. But maybe you're right, there is an element of ideology, because you always need that optimism, right? I think everyone here, we still have to retain or maintain that little kind of, I don't know, that little flame of optimism, because as soon as that goes out, we're redundant, we're useless as educators and human rights practitioners. So I'm not really sure if that's a great answer, but I'll pass the floor.
Thank you. Felisa?
I'm happy to go. Carlos, would you like to go, or shall I go? Okay. I think I was the one that may have used the term ideological hegemonic in my presentation, more around human rights. My students at Teachers College at Columbia are primarily internationals. I teach in the International Education Development department. And so students are not only not Americans, but they're non-Western in many cases. And one of the things I've actually learned to do is to invite critiques of human rights as a part of HRE. I used to wait and just see if it came up, and now I invite it, and partly because of the kinds of phenomenons that Aoife pointed out in her presentation, you know, the declarationist approach that was critiqued by Zimbalist and Kate. And this is all scholarship, but it has to do with practice. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, there used to be a time when I started to work, there was just the lawyers doing, you know, education on human rights standards. So we do have to recognize, I mean, we know that the critiques of human rights as a framework. I mean, put aside HRE, the human rights framework critiques of it being Eurocentric, historically specific, you know, the notions of individual rights. We have to be aware of those critiques. Moreover, the individualist versus the community approach. So I have myself invited, I've actually proposed these critiques to students, which makes everyone sigh a great, you know, a great sigh of relief. and we discuss it. I also give the counterpoints to it. I also give the arguments against, you know, the you know, the potentiality that it would be just sort of top down, here's human rights, take it or leave it, I hope you love it, right? So I do think I think we have to be aware as human rights educators that those critiques are there and involve our students in those critiques, especially if they're, in my case, if they're going to be educators and they need to be able to embrace different points of view. However, in terms of human rights education, I'm actually a believer that human rights education can save some of these critiques of human rights being hegemonic and ideological, precisely because of the kinds of things we're talking about in this panel, because we're inviting open dialogue. I went quickly through some slides because I was going long, but I fully agree with what Carlos was saying. I mean, across all the experiences I've had teaching, facilitating, co-learning human rights with learners, it's dialogue, it's personal narrative, and it's critical thinking. And I mean, I'm a pedagogue, so I have to put those into tidy categories, but Carlos's story is a beautiful one. I mean, it is how it goes. It's very Ferrerian, right? And if we do that around human rights education, we are the antidote to human rights being ideological, because we're inviting critical thinking and reflection, and it includes human rights, and it includes our societies, and it includes all the evidence that we might find that Aoife presented on systemic injustice. So yeah, I think we can have that antidote, but I think I personally try to be very, very aware of the critiques. And I even say to students, human rights is not an ideology, because when sometimes they start falling in love with the idea, you know, because it does speak to their experience, you know, and they all of a sudden they're in love with human rights. And it's like, okay, yeah, but there's the so what. One final comment, because Aoife, I'm also a real fan of Zimbalist and Kate. And one of the, and under Kate and I, who was on the South African Human Rights Commission, who was seconded to the Ministry of Education, well, Department of Education in South Africa, to infuse human rights after apartheid concluded, who was a real believer in HRE, became disenchanted, actually. We've had a lot of conversations about this. He became disenchanted with how it was offered in schools. I mean, and I think all of us would probably recognize it wasn't the way we would want to do it. But what he ended up working on were alternative pedagogies, which he's kind of separated out from the human rights language. He and Zimbalist call it humanizing pedagogy, or the pedagogy of mutual vulnerabilities, because of the legacy of racism in South Africa, and because human rights has its own legacy there as well. And for him, human rights might be presented as a framework, but he doesn't even feel like the students have to accept that particular framework per se. I'm not as loose in a way. I'm a little bit more, come on, we need a little bit more people behind at least the idea that human rights has some potential, right? So I'm kind of a believer, and I share my positionality. But he came to believe that the true pedagogies around human rights education would be not using the language, and it would be like, I think, Aoife, to your point, the equalization, understanding that there is implicit privilege even amongst differences of privilege amongst learners. And so the humanizing mutual vulnerabilities is a whole pedagogy that makes us human with one another. And from there we move forward.
Right, thank you. Carlos?
I'm going to pass this one because I think Aoife and Felisa have said the right things here, and I agree completely with that. I'm moving
Right.
to the next question when we start.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions already in the Q&A. I wonder if you had a chance to look through these. I think, while you ponder them, I also want to make another observation myself. I've been engaged in the past couple of years working on hate speech, traveling to many countries in very traumatic situations, like Sri Lanka, for example, after the bombing there last year. And I find that, there's often the perception that human rights are culturally neutral, and therefore they ought to travel everywhere in the same fashion. There's, of course, argument to be made for that, but then it doesn't go very well in the local context when these arguments don't resonate with local symbols. I'm a big fan of listening to people. You just mentioned the value of co-learning with learners and how that becomes an important way of doing this. I'm also mindful that human rights are a work in progress, in the sense that while there are a core set of rights, we learn what's the implications in different contexts. We learn about different ways of advancing them. We learn about different nuances, and all that comes from engaging with people in diverse situations and how they experience those violations. So, what would you say about how you can tailor? Of course, for education, you would have tailor education to contexts. But rights education, how well does that travel across cultural boundaries?
Well, if I can chip in first, very quickly, I will say that something I think there was a really good comment and question, because we tend to forget the human rights in relation to cultural sensitivity or how human rights require interpretation. Judges are constantly interpreting human rights according to a specific set of cultural, social, political, and legal frameworks. They're always doing that, So the thing is, we tend to forget that human rights are not monolithic. The human rights are embodied, as I explained before. And from the moment we understand what embodiment of rights actually means, we understand that human rights have to be interpreted according to a specific cultural context and historical and social and political. Now, is that an easy process? No, it's not. It creates tensions? Yes, it does. But that's part of the job. That's what it is, in my opinion. So we cannot avoid, because I think one of the biggest threats for the understanding of human rights from an educational point of view, is to think that human rights, as you said, are neutral or they're monolithic, because they're not. They have an origin, and we need to understand that critically, as Felisa has said. And that's part of what we need to know. Human rights emerge within a context. It can be a top-down approach or a bottom-top approach, but rights are constructed, negotiated, developed in different set of circumstances. But also rights are applicable in different set of circumstances. And I think that is a really important thing. So to be afraid that culture is a threat to human rights, I think is very misleading, completely. So this is why I believe in the power of human rights in relation and in dialogue and in embodied experiences, social and individual experiences.
Great. Would anyone want to add to that, or we'll leave it at that?
Sure, I can add just quickly. I'm not really sure about how the, I don't know, the contextualization or the bringing of rules, of these universal norms into specific cultures, how that works in practice in terms of education, because I just don't have experience of it. But I was wondering, but this is more of a general question, or more of a possibly a philosophical question, but to link back to a point that Felisa made about humanizing pedagogies, perhaps it is the solution. Because in essence, doesn't it come back to, and this is how we discuss matters of human rights with our students, an understanding of humanity as to who is human and why they're human. Sometimes, I mean, the obvious answer is in human rights, but maybe there are culturally specific traditions that resonate, and that might be a way to kind of bridge so that languages can speak to each other. Because obviously different cultures and religions have grappled with these issues since time immemorial. So that might be a better reference point rather than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the ICCPR or what have you.
Great, thank you.
Can I just really briefly, I promise to be brief.
I think this is a core issue for human rights, of course, and I think that the term I've landed on, which I feel very happy with, is quasi-universalism. So recognizing, you know, the elements of human rights that we might claim are universal, but that there are, as you said, Carlos, and also and Ahmed, you know, very specific interpretations essentially of that. Now that's a gray area to some degree, right? At what point do we say, okay, well, women's role in traditional societies, it's just how it is, but you know, this is equal but different, right? So we can't dodge that that problem. But there are, Eve, to your point, I mean, when I do the history of human rights, I begin with Confucianism and Buddhism and the antecedents that were not only legal but also religious, because human society has tried to and had to set up rules for living together and rules for justice. I'll end here, but there's a project that my students in my Peace and Human Rights Education class have been doing this semester. There's an artist who's going to be developing, by the way, he is unnamed, but he's going to be developing the first graphic history of human rights book. He's an artist, a cartoonist, and he feels that that's going to be a really nice and new appealing way to promote human rights education among young people. And I've had my students, I put them in pairs to actually do research on exactly this. I have students in pairs, and they're finished their work now, researching the original religious text, or in some cases a kind of a movement like the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement, which preceded, you know, the United Nations, to look for those connections that eventually would be codified, right, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other standards. So the students have been looking at Buddhism, Confucianism, Jainism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, of course, and a number of religious traditions, just to show this. And the book will try to demonstrate that it's a codification of values that societies and religious creeds have had for many, many years. It's key.
Excellent, thank you. We have a couple of questions on the question Q&A section. I'll read them out to you and you can respond to them. The first one is from Susan. I also have a passion, and that is for children's rights. Do you not think that such discussions as you have all described should also be among children? Any perspectives on children? That's the first question. Second is from Shumi, and her question is, how would you want to do education in schools in white-dominated countries? What is the outcome you want to see? So please feel free to respond to either or both of those questions, please.
Okay, I'm going to have what a great question. I love these seminars because I was thinking about children as well, because I was remembering some of my friends who are now professors in Chile of philosophy, who develop an entire pedagogy of human rights with children, but basically follow the same principles that I was mentioning before, because all these guys who are my friends, we are coming from the same place. And that was how to develop a participatory methodology for children where they become aware of their rights. So it's not about teaching them anything, it's about reflecting on their own rights and how they can construct an understanding of a critique of rights from their own perspectives. Oh, I find this absolutely fascinating. In fact, I think I'm going to include this in my teaching next year. This is going to be, no, thank you so much. I think it's absolutely spot on.
That's a great question. Yeah. Anybody else on that or the second question?
On children's rights, if I can jump in, I would encourage that, especially again in the formal schooling system, which it doesn't need to be, but I'm just focused on that as a complement to my other colleagues here on the panel. I think the whole school approach is really very important. And this gets also into the through human rights piece I mentioned earlier, especially for little children. So the human rights education for younger children, there are ways that you can present it so that it's very user-friendly. I mean, I don't know how much detail to go into, but social emotional learning, that also feeds into, I think, foundational ways of knowing oneself and being with others that's respectful and affectionate and good at listening. So I think I would just invite people to think about and there's literature out there on the whole school approach, and there's a great rights respecting responsibility experience in the UK itself, which it's my model for whole school approaches to HRE, which work very well.
You reminded me of a UNESCO policy framework came out last year on teaching anti-Semitism, but teaching how to combat anti-Semitism in school classroom context, going through the whole school approach as it were. So covers young children right away through the school system. So I think there are guidance frameworks that UNESCO may have developed in this area. Aoife, you want to comment on this or the other question?
Sure. Yeah, I'll give a stab at this. We're currently in the 4th phase of the World Programme on Human Rights Education, which focuses on youth. In secondary schools here in the UK, it's really ad hoc as to whether human rights is taught or not. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, it has been integrated into the curriculum, but not in England. I just might promote a little program that I'm developing myself. It's going to be, fingers crossed, delivered in schools in Essex. It's called Including Others. And it's based on, it'll be basically, we're going to put together several recordings and then we're going to screen them in schools. So the first recording is a human rights expert who's going to discuss a rights-based approach to certain different groups. So we're going to look at women, we're going to look at race, we're going to look at disabilities and LGBT plus rights. And then the second recording is going to be a counter story. And the counter story is a technique or a technology, an approach that was developed in critical race theory. So it's basically to narrate an experience of life through a minority perspective. So we'll put an award out. There will be call to all students within University of Essex to compile a counter story, and they'll get an award and an opportunity to record their counter stories, about 8 or 10 minutes. And then we have a supported dialogue afterwards. So the whole purpose is to try to break down stereotypes and these assumptions are about groups and about people in society. So again, to kind of hit at the structural point that was in my presentation earlier, in fact, it's a great opportunity to get in there early, to get in there with this age cohort, 13 to 15-year-olds, and see what can be done.
Great, thank you. We're having more comments and information in the Q&A and chat box, and thank you for those who are posting them. And we have another question. Do the panel have any thoughts or advice on developing and introducing human rights education for patients and staff in a mental health context, in hospital contexts? Linked to right to health, I suppose. Or beyond, yeah. Anyone?
Very briefly, I don't have anything specific. I think that's a fantastic area to explore more. I will, I guess, share with you that there is a new, in fact, it was officially launched today, the website, but there's a new, I think it's a global network of psychologists for human rights. So there is a movement, it's sort of an emerging movement of within the profession of psychology to recognize the relevance of human rights and the added value. I've actually done a couple of articles that just came out this year with a psychologist on human rights education for psychologists, and those could be psychology students that are just studying the discipline. They could be training to become therapists or psychologists. They could be researchers or all of the above. So I don't have a specific answer, but I will tell you that there's increasing interest in this. I don't know if I can find the URL, I'll post that so you can have a look. But there's a couple of publications that have come out, Psychologists and Human Rights, just this year. And I think there's more, there will be more in the future. I think this is a great area to focus on more patients' rights.
Great, thank you.
Wait a minute, I would like to say something in relation to that question too.
Yeah, please.
And I think it's a great question, because basically you have identified one of those places where rights have to be also understood. And it's the same principle with schools or in prisons, is to understand that individuals are subjects of rights. So if I may contribute to whoever asked the question, because I have done this in the past when I was younger and I had hair, to develop workshops, participatory methodologies with patients, with prisoners, it's the same principle that when you do it in a school. And it's about how you can become aware of what rights do you have, because you haven't lost your rights. So any participatory approach that includes all people involved, meaning patients, psychiatrists, nurses, everyone. And I think that is, of course, you need to tailor this to according to specific context and realities, obviously. And it's not easy, but it's a great, great potential there. Yes.
Can I ask a question that is linked to these questions? And that's because you see in various funding calls, a lot, of course, focused on funds to support capacity building of rights defenders, and often a focus on countries where literacy human rights is low. And there are, of course, systemic concerns about rights violations. And the identified need is in those situations to have people go to the ground, so to speak, and talk to young people, mobilize young people, as Carlos would have done, about rights, their rights, and how they could be, defending them. And beyond that, of course, building local capacity, first document, monitor, document, report, but also through that educate themselves and others. How does these sort of interests by various donor organizations dovetail with the focus on rights education as such, or pedagogical approaches to rights education? Is this an important part of rights education, capacity building of rights defenders to monitor, document, and report on rights violations?
Okay. If the answer to that question is absolutely yes. Human rights is all about contributing to capacity building in a dialogical way, because to sketch it in a very caricature way, it's not about parachuting in a situation, organizing a workshop and leave. The people who are dealing with human rights is everyone in their everyday experience. So anything they can contribute to the strengthening of the understanding of their own rights, to the strengthening of the capacity to work together around those rights, and the capacity of working together towards formulating, very important, is formulating and advancing rights is an absolute must. So this is why it's so important to understand correctly what capacity building actually means. It's not a buzzword that many sometimes use in forms and applications, and in fact, to the point that sometimes we just put anything that comes to our head as a participatory approach in a very simple way without really thinking it through. So I think it's a very, very important question, and absolutely important, Hamed.
Okay, thank you. Aoife, you want to comment earlier, did you?
Yeah. Just, I mean, it might be quite a superficial response, but it is on the issue of these mental health contexts. In a way, a reading of mental health context as being somehow apart or aside from the community, I think is erroneous. I think that mental health is something that we contend with every day with our students. In the journey to a PhD, apparently about a third, that's about 33% of students experience mental health difficulties. I would imagine there's a proliferation now in the way that we've been working this year, 2020. So there's increased anxiety, increased insomnia. We have to try to figure these things out immediately in our pastoral care of students. And in a way, we're not necessarily trained. So in some respects, it just happens. It may be a predisposition. But I think these are important points that we need to reflect in on as to how we're delivering that pastoral care, because obviously it's beyond the not simple frameworks. It's beyond the content, if you like, of the teaching that we're delivering, but there's all of the stuff along the sides that is really, really important, I think, to consider and to think about. I suppose the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities might be an area to look at, insofar as it encourages or really focuses in on a participatory approach to people's rights. But that's all I have for the moment.
Thank you. I just want to invite all panelists to reflect, personally. I mean, it's been a very traumatic year for everybody with the pandemic. That's one. But also, the past few years have been traumatic for everybody as well. We've seen globally rise of what we call populism, pushback on rights, and very polarizing societies. In many cases, fighting about the curriculum, wars about what can be in a curriculum about human rights, what can be taught to children. All these, things really come into head in the past few years. Any personal reflections on how this journey in the past few years may have affected this focus we have on rights education, and any lessons you have on, or insights you have on what we should be doing in the time to come as a result of these experiences?
I'm happy to share a project I worked on in this context. It's not, so it's personal. It's personal in the sense that, and maybe this is true for all of us on this panel, that if I see something, I feel like I have to do something. It's like, I can't just sit. So I'm going to share actually in the chat box, there's a curriculum that I actually worked on with an amazing writer. And this is where you can find it. It's a pandemic, we're calling it the pandemic curriculum. And I will share, because I think it'll be interesting to see. So the pandemic curriculum, I know the icon is not so great, but we ended up, of course, because all these human rights, the kind of structural violence that Eve referred to in her presentation, her first presentation, were so clearly revealed in the ways that the pandemic's rolled out. So we ended up working on a few things, 4 modules. So this is, you can go look this up yourself, but I want to show you. So the modules that we worked on, which was a way for me, Ahmed, to expiate my own, just to do something. So the first module we have looks at COVID-19 through a human rights lens. And we look at international examples, and we invite students to look at, for example, the right to healthcare, the right to education, the right to food and water, which has been impacted by the pandemic. So we took it as an opportunity to take what's already out there in the media and turn it into human rights education, but also keeping a critical lens and all. But we also know that students have been suffering, teachers have been suffering, we've all struggled. So we have a multimedia format where students, not only is there a whole module where students can share their own experiences, they can use written word, they can use images, they can use the creative arts, they can do a photo montage, but to sort of document what it's been like for them to be in lockdown or partial lockdown, and to share that internationally even. So again, I'm working towards connectivity amongst youth and youth culture across different environments. And then we had other things, media sources and taking action. So that was my response. And I do invite you to take a look at the curriculum if you're interested. It was just launched a few weeks ago. But that was the opportunity that we saw. Like, was it Carlos who said, human rights are everywhere? Yeah. And there's always opportunities. And to take that and to motivate and to also help engage, person to person. I think that was our intention. We'll see, it's just been launched.
That's really great. Thanks for sharing that, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on the post-pandemic or the pandemic-linked reflections on where we ought to be going next with rights education?
I'll give it a bat. It's been a long day. And a long year in Zoom. Right. I'd like to try to figure out frameworks that could be used in the classroom, but I have an idea about. So don't kill me quite yet. But the idea would be how to instrumentalize radical kindness. So kindness as a kind of antidote to what we have been, like the populism that you mentioned and what we've been experiencing. Also and Ahmed, I'm really, really interested in your thoughts on this, but the role of social media in the type of divisions that we're seeing, for example, in the United States. And I have recommended the social dilemma before, but how we then occupy these echo chambers and the kind of impact that has, for example, on freedom of thought and conscience. But anyway, in line with what I presented earlier on, the framework that I'd like to develop, the idea of instrumentalizing radical kindness, I think we need to think about engaging in how we engage with technologies into the future in human rights education. Obviously, we have to engage in some respect. But, and this kind of speaks to some of the work that, Ahmed, you've been doing in the context of the Big Data Project. It's about how, you know, the role of artificial intelligence in education in the future and the kind of equalizing possibilities that are there, but how, if also the other bugbear that we have is to see, we see spaces of privilege. We don't want that privilege just to be replicated in these technologies, like in access to artificial intelligence, in the same way that privilege allows people access private tutors and which allows entry into the academy, you know. So we want to be able to somehow break rather than perpetuate privilege. We have to think of forces, ways of doing so. And as I argued earlier on, I think to really tackle some of the structural issues in society in whatever way, whatever capacity we can do so, and to encourage our students to do the same, that's my kind of hopeful end point or starting point.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if I may just add a few thoughts there. You know, I really connect with your point about Galtung's structural violence idea and digital divides we find in the digital space. The divides coming out of infrastructural limitations because some countries don't have the infrastructure, but other divides as well based on, I don't know, access to other resources. Poverty is one, but also gender is often one of these barriers because the way people behave on the cyberspace, from the programming, all of that is a turn-off or a challenge for certain people to be on there. So there are a number of divides in the digital space that reflect challenges for human rights, reflect structural violence, and we need to be sort of, you know, be mindful of that. And something we've been talking about is various forms of literacy. So we speak about digital literacies to alert people to the shortcomings in this area, but also in regard to hate speech, how various social media platforms could be disseminating hatred, disinformation, malinformation, whatever, because people are not really geared to judge, assess the nature of the information that's passing through their feeds. So that's an important dimension to add to what we earlier talked about as human rights literacy. But something I'm finding is that having worked as human rights defender, I suppose, for a number of years, I'm finding that the conversations in those spaces are not very well informed by human rights education pedagogy. So there is, I think, a need to really sort of, break these silos. And what Professor Tibbetts mentioned earlier about her class on, I thought it's peace and education. At the UN, we spent 3 years now, and I suppose close to £1 million on this, trying to get people of all faiths and none into a room and ask them the same question. Can you describe from your faith-based commitments how to get to human rights for everybody? So there are people doing this already, and it would have been very easy to engage people like yourself in this process to draw from your expertise. So there is this, I think, it's the siloed approaches not enabling us to really find the synergies of what it's doing. And the link with the digital, if you like, aspect is very important. And radical kindness is a great concept. In the work I have been doing, I've been using the word empathy-based learning. And the way this came about was when I was working on tackling anti-Semitism and, of course, Holocaust denial. I found that much of the education on Holocaust wasn't really generating empathy towards Jewish communities. It was very much something happened in history, and then it tends to perpetuate a victim perspective of Jewish communities, not really getting the contributions they're making today, not really understand the full experience of Jewish people. So it doesn't really create empathy towards them. In Sri Lanka, I found that the schooling system was so pillarized. If you're born Buddhist, you go to a Buddhist school and you probably won't meet a Muslim or Hindu or Christian or atheist young person until you went to a workplace. By the time things have gone very far. So empathy-based peer-to-peer learning was something that was really coming up out of these contexts. So I think what you said today speaks to that, the need to have empathy-based learning. but also learning from a peer-to-peer basis. I was trying to look at the graphs you posted, Felisa. It went very fast, I couldn't really figure it out. I was trying to figure out in the US, in South Africa, India, Sweden, how much of those learning methodologies actually involved peer-to-peer learning. Because I think young people won't listen too much from someone of my age telling about human rights. They probably learn more from people of their age as to how they have experienced human rights. So any thoughts on how for your idea on radical kindness matches with empathy-based learning, and how your research on those countries, Felisa, speak to peer-to-peer learning as a tool to advance human education? So a very, very long-winded question, but I thought I'll ask them of you.
Is it a question for me?
For both of you.
I fully support the idea of peer-to-peer learning, and I just went back to my slides to see if we had asked. I think we asked about it, and it didn't show up as a methodology that was used much at all. So I'm not sure how to. I think in the non-formal education sector, it might be easier to think about having peer learning as a kind of standard, especially beginning. I'm not sure what ages you were working with, Ahmed. So I love the idea, and I think it's consistent with what we've sort of generally talked about in terms of, dialogical learning and the instructor as a facilitator, not as a teacher. In fact, one of the benefits of non-formal learning experience is it's supposed to not be like school. So, yeah, I think that's a great methodology to put out for us to discuss. And I'm trying to think how much I've seen it. I mean, I think what you're talking about is more than small group work. It's really like a core pedagogy, right? So I guess we have some time left. I'd love to hear more about how you did that, and what were the settings in which you did it in, and how did it work?
Yeah, these were some things I did, but I learned in Sri Lanka that there are a nationwide program targeting youths of all ages, so children as well, because they need to break this siloed approach to the pillared approach to education. They would have young Hindu boys and girls spend a week with a community of, across the divides for a week. So just amongst themselves in some supervised, of course, environment. But the idea was to learn about the other in their own contexts rather than being told about them in some classroom context. And it was across all ages, right to the schooling age. And it had great reviews in terms of what feedback they were getting from participants in that exercise. On the peer-to-peer, more adult-based learning, I was referring to experience of anti-Semitism, sort of combating that, and dealing with football-based, if you like, more adult type racism. And again, the idea was that rather than listen to a UN person in a suit and tie, get one of your own football, heroes to come and talk to you about their own journeys from some sort of, if you like, narrow-minded perspective to more open-mindedness. So these sort of things were across the, if you like, both formal and informal learning environments.
Thanks. I just to explain that. Then another kind of approach that is, I think, fills out more of the kind of examples you've given is the use of sports as well. There's really kind of a link between sports and human rights, and part of the agenda is exactly the one that you mentioned, which is bringing young people together from different communities that might not otherwise be seeing each other, and moreover to put them in an environment where they're on a team together, because the research has shown to overcome prejudices, it's important not only to have exposure, of course contact helps, but to actually be put together in constructive, not internally competitive per se, in project kinds of work where you have to collaborate, you really get to know each other. The empathy point is super important. I know I've read some studies also where students who've gone on field trips, for example, to Birkenau or Auschwitz, are moved by the history of it, but don't translate it to sort of modern days of views and recognize the ongoing, discrimination or discriminatory attitudes, if not against Jews, against other groups. It's a very profound problem. And one of the things I can only say is that in the study that I didn't do, it was a study in Germany. One of the features of the learners, and that in this case it was secondary schools in Germany. One of the features of learners who they were moved by the human rights message were those that were empathetic. They applied a variety of tools to try to understand personality, et cetera, et cetera. So where does it stick? I mean, I have students that's in my peace and human rights education classes, they self-select in, so that's really a very welcoming crowd. But if you're a teacher in a school system or even a non-formal ed system where you're trying to address these things, like who are the people for whom it stays? And the answer partly is those who are somehow exhibiting features of empathy, because that's the I have to do something piece of it. And it's somewhat gender identified, a little bit more common amongst females than males, but of course it would never be deterministic. So I think the empathy thing is super important, and I think we have some research that shows that. And how do we do that, make that happen without doing what Zembalist has been super critical of, which is commodifying human rights violations, because this is also a problem. I know that's not what you were talking about. You were talking about just humanizing, getting to know one another, connections, the person-to-person piece of it. But on the other human rights side, there's the human rights violation approach to HRE, where a teacher might think, oh, I'm promoting empathy, but in fact, it's pity instead, right? And so there's also that issue we have to grapple with, I think, in this somewhat treacherous environment.
Great, thank you. We're running down the clock here. Any final takeaways, anybody? Any final thoughts in a minute to just wrap up?
Could I just maybe very, very briefly pick up on the point about empathy and affect and emotion, because I think there is a lot more research and theory, particularly around education, human rights education, contextualizing in this way. And it reminds me of Richard Rorty's work on sentimental education, and how stories human rights would be translated through stories that really evoke and show the position of the other, but not a cheap sentimentality. So I think that was the key point. And it's probably along that tradition where I'm thinking about radical kindness as a way to humanize the other. So to kind of pick up on that, I think it could be more powerful than the abstract idea of dignity, of human dignity, which I believe is an intersubjective concept anyway that happens in community with others. So yeah, I think that's an area that we naturally will explore into the future too.
Great. Any final comments, Carlos, Felisa?
Okay, only in 10 seconds is that what we have just done today is exactly the kind of activities I will do with one of my classes, because I will start having the same type of question they will raise today and open the forum for a conversation about this. And this is why I think that in human rights practices, we learn from one another. So the type of comments and insights that we provided today, the experiences that we brought in, I think are absolutely fundamental. And I think we never have to fall for just repeating the same style of teaching, the same time of, no, we can change. And I'm talking seriously. What we have done just now, I'm going to reflect on this and I'm going to use it as a starting point for one of my modules. That's it. So thank you so much for the idea.
So finally, Professor Tibbets, your final takeaways, please.
I had plenty to say. It's just been a pleasure to be with all of you, Aoife, Carlos, and Ahmed today. And thank you, Aoife, for organizing this. It was really a wonderful way. For me, I'm in New York City, so it's kicking off my International Human Rights Day. Thank you all. It's so nice to get to know you this way and to have the dialogue.
Well, thank you so much. So to wrap up, let me thank again our panelists for spending such a thought-provoking 90 minutes with us. Fantastic ideas. I've learned a lot in this 90 minutes from all three of you. Really appreciate that. I'm also grateful for the participants who are here, who joined us today, especially those who had posted questions that had really very thought-provoking as well. We will have a recording of this posted as soon as it gets processed through the Zoom processor, I suppose. But I also want to add my appreciation to the Human Rights Center, Aoife, for convening this, and for the events team, especially Sophie, for making sure that we were able to interface today. And finally, I want to remind you that the participants will probably get a pop-up survey in their inboxes, a post-event survey to sort of get some feedback from you on what you found most useful and things that will help us, I think, improve for the future. So with that, I want to say a big thank you to all of you and wish you a very enjoyable and fruitful and successful Human Rights Day and a great new year in 3 weeks' time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.